Demonic possession is a topic that most, if not all, horror fans have come across. It's been around for hundreds of years and often causes controversy. Skeptics will say that cases of demonic possession can generally be explained by a misunderstood mental illness of some kind, while religious institutions are quick to diagnose those demonstrating strange behaviour as signs of demonic infestation. Demonic activity of any kind is a terrifying experience for those involved, often leaving deep psychological scars for the victims. Regardless, it's an extremely popular topic, so here are 7 real cases of demonic possession. Number 7. Clara Germana. Clara was a South African girl, and in 1906 started exhibiting some troubling behaviour that started worrying those who were around her. Clara had a rough childhood, and was taken into a nunnery as an orphan at a young age. When she started making deep, guttural growls for seemingly no reason, the nuns became wary and described her voice as twisting into a veritable herd of wild beasts orchestrated by Satan. The nuns noted that the growls seemed impossible for a human to make and were more like the roars of an animal. They became even more worried when Clara began having intimate conversations with an entity that only she could see. The conversations began visually disturbing Clara, until one day, where she ran to the nuns and begged them to fetch the priest, and needed to do it quickly, otherwise Satan would kill her. She then confessed at age 16 she made a pact with the devil, which led the sisters to believe that this was a real infernal assault. This became more evident as Clara started speaking languages that she had never learned, such as Polish and Latin. Clara's situation rapidly worsened as she developed incredible strength, enough to overpower several grown men. Clara became increasingly hostile to the nuns, who were closely watching her, and she repelled any effort to place the Bible or a crucifix on her body. The nuns demanded an exorcism be performed, and 2 priests were dispatched to conduct it. When the priests arrived, Clara attacked them on sight. The exorcism lasted all night, and the priests were exhausted in their attempts to drive out the spirits. The demon was eventually driven from Clara when she levitated off the floor, an event that was witnessed by nearly 200 people. Clara survived the ordeal and returned to her quiet life at the nunnery. Number 6. Roland Doe. This case is said to be the inspiration for the 1973 film The Exorcist, in which a girl is terrorized by demonic forces. It all started when Roland Doe, which is an alias used to protect the victim's identity, lost his aunt, who he is very close with. Distraught by the loss, the young boy used a spirit board in a desperate attempt to make contact with her. After the initial use, Roland's family became plagued by strange phenomena. The family would hear sounds of marching feet within the house, as if someone was practicing a dance upstairs, only there was no one upstairs. The goings-on turned much more sinister when objects started moving around the house, seemingly of their own volition. It even followed Roland when he left the house, when his school desk was reportedly moved across the room by an unseen force, an event that was witnessed by his whole class, including his teacher. Whatever it was that was causing this to happen, had took a great interest in Roland. After visiting the hospital, the family grew frustrated with the doctor's constant attempts to pin the strange happenings on a mental illness, and so made contact with the Protestant pastor. The pastor invited the boy to his house for a night of observation. During the course of the night, the pastor heard scratching noises coming from inside the walls and watched a heavy armchair upturn on its own. In the morning, the pastor urged the family to make contact with the Catholic priest. The Catholic priest conducted multiple exorcisms on Roland, the first being carried out in hospital, where, disastrously, Roland slipped out of one of his arm restraints and slashed the priest with the bed spring. The priest called in help from the Archbishop, who, based on reports of 2 of his associates who attended the boy's house and witnessed the phenomena worsening, namely by objects being thrown across the room and another voice emerging through Roland, authorized several rituals of salvation. Reportedly, the sessions prompted Roland to become increasingly more violent towards the priest, and he began speaking Latin, which was deemed impossible by his family because he had no prior education of how to speak it. The priest succeeded in saving the boy's life, and drove away a demon of immense power. The definitive fate of Roland is now unknown, though it is assumed that he led a perfectly normal and healthy life after the ordeal. Number 5. The Demon in Connecticut. There are some cases of demonic activity that go down in history as being extremely terrifying and hard to debunk. The Amityville haunting is one of the most famous and most documented hauntings to date, but once I discovered these clips, I knew I had to share them. The Smurl family haunting refers to the claims of the Smurls of Connecticut, who stated that a demonic force occupied their home for around 15 years. It began when they heard strange knocking sounds coming from inside the walls in the middle of the night. As soon as the noises began, a foul odour began emerging all throughout the property and was making the family feel unwell. At first the activity was fairly minimal, but after a few years the demon began acting out more violently towards the family. According to the Smurls, their family dog was thrown against the wall by an unseen force, the beds began shaking violently, and Jack, who is the father of the family, was sexually assaulted by the demon. The demon's malevolent actions intensified, and this led the family to make contact with famed paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, who, in Ed's own words, used religious provocations to make contact with the demon, which shook household items violently in an attempt to dissuade Ed from continuing. Watch the footage for yourself.
Give me some sign. Is that you moving something? Give me some sign that you're here.
What I did was use religious provocation. I have to provoke it into some type of outward manifestation, and that was my point in doing that.
In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to reveal your identity.
The little girl is trying to do her homework, but you can see that the chair keeps sliding backwards.
You're holding it down, aren't you? It's got that much strength to it.
Now, if you watch, you can see the little girl's legs are up on the rungs of the chair. She's not pushing herself up from the floor. The mother is not tipping that chair backwards. No. Nobody is touching that table. The table moves of its own volition.
Ed watched as the demon inscribed a message in the mirror and on the walls, telling him and the family to get out, and formed into a black mass and came at him. After Ed, Lorraine and the Smurls made contact with this demon, they contacted the Catholic Church to perform a full exorcism. The family and the Warrens became under scrutiny, and many medical professionals determined that the goings-on in the home were down to hallucinations, schizophrenia, or a downright hoax. To be honest, the first two assertions certainly don't explain the footage, as the furniture is clearly moving without anyone moving it, especially the chair, which is lifting the weight of a child off the ground whilst the mother's hands are on the back of it. Could the family have really made up the whole thing? Personally, I find it doubtful, considering the calibre of Ed and Lorraine Warren, whose reputations were undoubtedly on the line. Number 4. The Witches of Iowa. Anna Eklund was a relatively normal small-town American girl who was raised, as many Americans were, a devout Catholic. However, there were questions surrounding her parental guardians. Her father and her aunt allegedly practiced witchcraft and regularly accosted her with strange idols and dolls, and purportedly used herbs to poison her food. As a result, Anna began exhibiting strange behaviour. She developed an aversion to religious objects and could not for the life of her enter a church, despite the fact that she had been a regular at her church all her life. The locals became extremely worried by her behaviour and called upon the local priest to conduct an exorcism. In 1912, she was said to have been cured after an exorcism, but in a bizarre and incredibly dark twist of fate, her guardians prayed to the devil and begged him to allow Anna to suffer even more. This opened the gate to allow several demonic entities to possess Anna, and these were said to be the same demons that later possessed Anneliese Michel. According to the witches, the most powerful demon, Beelzebub, had successfully possessed Anna. Years passed, and in 1928 Anna sought help from the church. For her own safety, she was placed in a convent and cared for by the nuns. Unfortunately, Anna's condition worsened when the nuns began blessing her food before she ate it. Anna could sense the nuns blessing her food, and so hissed whenever the holy food came near her. If the food wasn't blessed, she would be able to eat it. An exorcism was immediately called, and her behaviour became downright terrifying. She began to speak and understand languages that she had no way of knowing, and spat at the priests when they came close. Also, a room full of witnesses testified to seeing her cling to the wall and climb vertically to the ceiling before tumbling back down to the bed, and her eyes bulged from her sockets whenever holy verses were read to her. The exorcism lasted almost a month, however the priests and Anna overcame the diabolical forces inside her, and she continued to live a quiet life in the convent. Nothing is known about the witches after Anna was separated from them. Number 3. The Butcher of Ossett, Michael Taylor. This is another story of a church-going man who was assaulted by demonic forces. Michael Taylor was a regular man in northern England who attended several church meetings with his wife. Michael had told his wife on numerous occasions that he felt evil inside him, and this became more evident as he had several run-ins with the chair of the church meetings he went to. Church members reported that Michael would scream at the top of his voice to the chairperson of the meetings and would have a maniacal look upon his face. He was forgiven on the first occasion, but when his behaviour didn't improve, the local vicar called in other ministers to perform a ceremony of deliverance on him. The ministers stated that in an all-night ceremony they had discovered spirits of incredible evil in him and driven out the demons of incest, bestiality and blasphemy. Michael was so exhausted by the whole ordeal, he begged the priest to let him to return home to go to sleep. They were reluctant to allow this, as they said he still had powerful demons lurking inside him, primarily the demon of murder. They did eventually allow him to go home, though I'm sure after they discovered what occurred the night they released him, their worst fears must have been imagined. As soon as Michael went home, he brutally murdered his wife in an atrocious attack. He bludgeoned her to death with his bare hands, gouging out her eyes and her tongue, and tearing her face clean off her skull. Taylor then turned his attention to the family poodle, who he strangled to death. Michael was found by a police officer wandering the streets, mumbling inaudible things to himself and covered in blood. He was committed to the Broadmoor Mental Hospital, but was eventually released. At the time of his release, Taylor had been exhibiting the same kind of strange behaviour that preceded his wife's brutal murder. Number 2. Anneliese Michel. One of the most famous demonic possession cases, Michel was a young German schoolgirl who was at the very least incredibly troubled. She suffered from depression and epilepsy, and had both these treated with medication. Michel started demonstrating increasingly strange behaviour that started veering outside the realms of her diagnosed illnesses. She began to hear voices that were extremely aggressive and kept telling her that she belonged to the devil and that she was going to be damned to hell. Michel grew increasingly uncomfortable, and her classmates described her as withdrawn in her later years. She became intolerant to religious artifacts and started acting in depraved ways, like drinking her own urine and demanding sex. Medicine did nothing to help Michel, and eventually Catholic priests were called in to conduct an exorcism, many of which were recorded. Take a listen, but be warned, it's certainly disturbing.
Welches noch?
Und das sag ich Ihnen nicht.
Im Namen Jesu.
Nein! Nein! Der das ganze Deutschland verführt, oder? Ja, der ist ja noch drin.
Im Namen des dreifaltigen Gottes und aller Todessten Jungfrau Maria, sagt die Wahrheit.
Whatever your beliefs on demons and the spirit world, this is clearly the voice of someone who is going through an intense internal battle. Michel endured around 70 exorcisms, where her physical health deteriorated to the point which ultimately led to her death. The reason that I have not put this as number 1 is that the Catholic Church officially changed their stance on the case, stating that she had an undiagnosed mental illness and was not possessed, though many believe that this was due to the high publicity of the case, and the Church wanted to put this to bed as quickly as they could. Whatever the case, those growls did not come from someone who was healthy. Number 1. Frenchie Maurice was a farmer from New England in America. This is widely believed to be one of the most authentic demonic possession videos in the world, due to the physical changes demonstrated by the victim. Maurice, nicknamed Frenchie by his friends, lived a hard life on the farm with his abusive father. In his childhood, he often cried out to anyone who would help him live a happy life, and inadvertently called out to Satan for help. There is also a bizarre and dark mystery surrounding Frenchie and his childhood, where he witnessed something horrific in the barn, which has never been revealed, but he has hinted at involving a sexual act of some kind. As he grew older, Frenchie became plagued with dark thoughts and turned his guns into the sheriff and ordered them not to be returned to him for the fear that he was going to do something horrible. Unfortunately for Frenchie and his wife Nancy Theriot, this didn't stop the ordeal. They both reported strange goings-on at the property, where they heard voices in the house and blood leaking from the walls. Maurice reported that he couldn't remember large parts of his day, and random fires would break out around the property. The activities intensified and tended to centre around Maurice. Nancy reported that her husband started seemingly floating around the house, and that she would talk to him in one room, move to another, and see him standing there waiting for her, as if he had moved through the walls of the first room. Maurice had no recollection of these occurrences, and was unaware that he had left the room. Nancy reported that the vacant stares given by the figure just didn't seem human, and this was some kind of other Maurice that was moving around their home. This happened in front of several witnesses who often fled the property in terror. Eventually, Nancy contacted Ed and Lorraine Warren, who contacted Bishop Robert McKenna, who agreed to conduct an exorcism, despite the fact that it wasn't sanctioned by the church. They filmed the exorcism, and apparently, due to the appalling nature of the demon inside Maurice, Ed Warren was almost killed in the process.
This is called the ritual Germana, which is the ultimate in the rites of exorcism where Catholicism is concerned. He prepared himself, he went to the home.
And the exorcism will be the first ever recorded on videotape. A tape that shows Maurice's face changing from this to this as the bishop chanted to cast out the devil. Nancy Theria was present throughout the exorcism.
When they were doing the exorcism on him, when he turned his head, I saw his face change. I saw the satanic look on his face.
As the video shows, far more was about to change on Theria's face than its expression. As Bishop McKenna chants, Theria's skin seems to bubble. A deep crack has opened on his forehead.
Maurice, do you feel anything inside you?
I see characteristics of his face look like they're becoming all crinkled, like burnt. There's a split on the left side of the head, which widens, opens up. The eyes, he blinks 3 times, which we consider an insult to the Trinity. The eyes look like a serpent.
How many are you?
All of a sudden, his eyes rolled up in his head, and his head went down, he collapsed, and within a few minutes, he came to. The first thing he asked for was Nancy, his wife.
Like I said, it's extremely convincing. I'm very skeptical to the paranormal, though I do have an open mind. The exorcism was deemed a success, but things didn't end well for Maurice. Later in life, he was arrested for the sexual abuse of a minor, but to this day is reportedly free of the demon's control. Thank you again for joining me in this video. I hope you enjoy my content, and I'll post another video for you next week, this time focusing on unsolved mysteries that need some answers. Look after yourselves and return to the library soon.